Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name's Paul Quigley. I teach in the history department at Virginia Tech. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, which is housed here in the Virginia Tech History Department, and is the center that's sponsoring tonight's lecture, Love and Duty, Confederate Widows and the Emotional Politics of Loss. And this is the last event in a busy academic year. Just this past weekend, we had a terrific academic conference on the subject of slavery during the American Civil War. Last month, we had our annual Civil War weekend with a field trip to Antietam. We've also sponsored a number of online talks like this one tonight throughout the year. We restarted our elementary school outreach program after a 2-year hiatus. So it's been a fun, enjoyable, educational, action-packed year for the center. And this is a really nice way to finish things off. I'm also, of course, looking forward to next academic year and already making plans for some great events to bring to you then. And you can keep up with everything that's going on at the center. Our website is civilwar.vt.edu. You can also find the center on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube as well. And our YouTube channel is growing all the time. We post videos of events like tonight's event will go up there, and you can watch them whenever you like on YouTube. So tonight's speaker is a great friend of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, Dr. Angela Esco Elder. She graduated from the University of Georgia with a PhD in history. And after getting her PhD, she worked here at the center for a year, 2016 to 17, as postdoctoral fellow. After that, she moved on to a job at Converse University, first as assistant professor and now as associate professor. She teaches some courses there that sound absolutely amazing, like Duels, Disease and Disaster, Death in 19th Century America, and another one called Disney's America, History and Performance, which I gather includes a field trip as well.
Yes.
She's a co-editor of a book called Practical Strangers, The Courtship Correspondence of Nathaniel Dawson and Elodie Todd, who was the sister of Mary Todd Lincoln. And of course, she's speaking to us tonight about her new book. I have a copy here, Love and Duty, Confederate Widows and the Emotional Politics of Loss. And when I say it's a new book, I mean, it's a brand new book. The official publication date, I think, is today, April 26th. So it's hot off the presses and now available for purchase anywhere, including the publisher UNC Press. And a little bit later, we're going to paste a link into the chat and give you a discount code. So if anyone's interested in purchasing the book tonight, you'll be able to get a nice discount from UNC Press. So the way it's going to work is Dr. Elder will speak for around about half an hour or so. So we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And as is usual with these webinars, we're going to ask you to type in your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. And we may not be able to get to every single question, but we'll try to address as many as we possibly can. We'll wrap things up somewhere between 8 and 8:15 Eastern time. So around an hour, a little more than an hour. So that's all from me. I want to say how grateful I am that Dr. Elder is able to join us tonight, especially on that very special publication day for your new book. We're really glad that you're sharing this day with us. So let's give Dr. Elder a virtual round of applause and welcome her to your screens. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Hopefully. All right, good. I see a thumbs up. All right. So thank you for such a warm welcome. I do have a soft spot, a huge soft spot for the center, for Virginia Tech. It was a fantastic year in that postdoc, and a lot of the revisions of this project were started in that place, in those offices. And I was actually just laughing at my profile picture. If you got on here early enough, when we were still the black screens, I took that out in front of our apartment at Virginia Tech, and I still haven't updated it, I realized. So welcome. I'm excited to be here with you tonight and share about my new book, Love and Duty. Confederate widows and the emotional politics of loss. So as you can imagine, like any author, I could talk ages and ages and ages about this. So I decided to give us a nice focused checklist, if you will, just like I do for my classes, to make sure we stay in our time parameters and get you on to your other events this evening. So I'm going to start with why this project. I know I always love looking and listening to how authors fall into the topics they write about. So I'm going to share a little bit of that story. Then I'll move into the argument. So any scholars out there, I know we're always looking, okay, now what is this hoping to contribute or build on? And so we'll talk about that. I'll talk about the title and how I settled on it. It's, again, something that I love to hear about from authors. And this one has a really interesting poem that ties to it. And UNC Press let me print in the front of the book. And then for about half the time, majority of the time, I'll give you a sneak peek into my last chapter, the 6th chapter, which is the chapter that has the newest research, the newest material. It's the one that I didn't want to write, if I'm being honest, but now it's one of my favorites, which I think is something that happens a lot of times. That thing that you didn't originally think would be part of the project becomes one of your favorite pieces. So that's what our plan is for tonight. All right, so why this project? This project began when I was a graduate student at the University of Georgia in one of Dr. John Inscoe's community studies classes. And I was a master's student and I needed a project, and I honestly had no idea what I was going to work on. I was interested in the Civil War. I was interested in women's history. So potentially combining those things, but again, didn't have a clear direction. And so I wandered over to the University of Georgia archives, which at the time was still in the library. Now it's in this big, beautiful facility. When I was there, it was up on a higher floor. It was kind of crammed in the corner, and it just fit that magical archival experience for me. And I started pulling boxes from the Civil War era and just reading through all of these family papers. And eventually fell into the story of Will and Rosa Deloney. And you can see Will here on your screen. Lived in Athens, Georgia. Their house was in downtown Athens. It's a parking lot now. They had gotten married about 6 years before the Civil War began. And when it breaks out, Will is going to leave and enlist in the Confederacy, like a lot of men in the area. When he left to fight, Rosa had 3 children under the age of 4. And so the collection was a series of folders, lots of letters, and I was just reading this back and forth about what was going on in each of their lives. And they struggled. They struggled with the separation. Rosa was pregnant with their 4th child. William was hoping to get a furlough to come back and be there for the birth of the child. And as you can see in this letter, this quote on the screen, at times he felt a longing for home that makes his army life almost insupportable. What I didn't realize, what Rosa didn't realize, was that was part of his final letter to her. And so when I flipped in the file, the next piece was the smaller slip of light blue paper, which you can see on your screen, a telegram that wasn't even sent to Rosa. It was sent to some of her neighbors, her good friends, that break the news that Will has been wounded. And they say, break the news to her on account of her condition as best you can, because she's about 8 months pregnant at the time. And so, long story short, Will is going to be captured. He's going to die in a Union hospital. Rosa, about a month later, is going to give birth to this 4th child. It's going to be a girl. And I was struck by this fact that here I am 150 years later holding, this slip of paper that changed her life, holding all of these letters. And I was also struck by the fact that this wasn't the end of the file, right? That there was so much more that happened after this man's death. And so after she gives birth, Rosa becomes very interested, very preoccupied with getting her husband's body home. Because he was an officer, she had the privilege of knowing where he had been buried, and she very much wanted him to be reinterred in Athens, Georgia, in the family cemetery, so she had a place to mourn. And so the war ends, fast forward a little bit more, and in July of 1866, that 4th child, the little girl, who was then a toddler, dies of whooping cough. And so A couple months later, Rosa is successful at getting Will's body home. And if you go to the cemetery today, you see these two graves side by side of the toddler and then of Will. And I was struck by this, right? I mean, obviously, this is not how Rosa would have planned her life. And if I hadn't spent that time in the archives, I wouldn't have known this whole story, that here is a family who was broken by this war. And now two people lie beside one another, father and daughter, who never met each other in life. And that's the story. That's the collection that started this whole project for me. And I became really interested in this idea of what was the Civil War like for widows. 750,000. That is the number that most historians give us as far as the number of men who died in the American Civil War, right? We know this is America's bloodiest war. We know that it's bloodier and that more people die in this war than many other US wars combined. One who's left behind, right? So this war creates widows by the hundreds and then the thousands and then the tens of thousands. Some of them are as young as 16 or 17 or 18 years old. Some of them barely know the men that they marry. They get married in this patriotic rush to the altar. And so estimates roughly give us that likely about 28% of the soldiers who enlisted were married. Again, this is hard in some cases to pinpoint because of the wartime marriages that are happening. But if we stick with that 28% number, then this war creates roughly 200,000 widows. And so death is something that weighs really heavily across the nation, and especially on the Civil War South, as many families are mourning brothers and sons and cousins and husbands. They're dressing in black, and it casts this visible dark shadow across many Southern communities. Judith McGuire, who was a diarist in Virginia, wrote, quote, "It is melancholy to see how many wear mourning." Or if you take this newspaper account that should hopefully be on your screen right now, this is a newspaper in North Carolina, published right after Christmas. It was written right around Christmas, and it says in the middle there, "The whole nation is a vast house of mourning. Christmas, once so merry and joyous, now finds the widow and her little ones clustered together in grief." Goes on a little bit, right? "All the horrors of hell seem to rise uppermost and turn the land into a vast human slaughter pen." And so these are the stories that brought me into this project. I became fascinated by this question of what war was like for widows, and then especially what it was like for Confederate widows, stuck on this idea of not only do they lose husbands, but they also lose the war, right? Union widows similarly grieve, similarly lose husbands, and endure a lot of the same mourning and grief. But the sacrifice was worth something, right? They saved the nation, they saved the Union, the United States lives on, all of the other things. But what about for Confederate widows? How does that look? How does that get processed? And so that leads us here. Oh, here's another image, right, of mourning. That leads us into our argument. And so on page 2, I tried to get it right up front in the book, since that's something that I always look for in the books that I'm reading for research and teaching. My argument, Love and Duty. This book argues that the emotional expressions of widows carried new political meaning amid the crisis of war and the battle to establish the Confederacy's legitimacy. So to unpack that a little bit here, I'm really fortunate to have so many strong scholars that I was able to build on, to have this really great foundation for this study. So people like Drew Gilpin Faust or Diane Miller Somerville or Anya Jabbour or Stephanie McCurry. I mean, could go on, and I do go on in my footnotes in my book, all these fantastic scholars who helped me to then notice the patterns in the sources when I was reading through them. And so we started, or at least I started in this research in looking at death and what widows expected, or what wives expected, and what white Americans especially expected when it came to death. And so this concept of the good death became essential, right? Essentially, in the 19th century, white families expected their loved ones to die in a particular way, right? Ideally, they are going to pass away at home at the end of a long life. They'll be surrounded by family. It would be really peaceful. It would be really religious. Everyone has a chance to say their final words, that sort of thing. And as you can imagine, not much about the Civil War connects with the good death. Here, all of a sudden, deaths are sudden, they're far from home. In many cases, families are at the mercy of strangers to even learn that the death had occurred. It was not something that families could control or communities could control. But what they could control was mourning, and they tried to. So they used antebellum etiquette and they build on it and to create this list of directives for women who are mourning their husbands. And so to go over some of the expectations, right? Widows, for example, are supposed to mourn for 2.5 years. For 2.5 years, they are in grieving. To give you a sense of the gender dynamics at the time, if a husband were to lose his wife, 3 months is standard for mourning, but for a widow, it's 2.5 years, and that was the longest time frame of all of the different categories. A widow should wear mourning, the idea being that her exterior should reflect her interior emotions. So black dresses, black veils, and then over the course of that 2.5 years, they would progress through grays and lavenders. And even widows who couldn't afford mourning were encouraged to dye their clothing black. And a lot of them do. And they'll write in letters to family members asking for directions and materials if they can't get black cloth to transform what they do have. And then for that 2.5 years, a widow should not remarry, right? The soldier should not be easily replaced. So no flirting, no dancing, no courting. If you're familiar with Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara, not a good widow, right? Does not live up to the expectations this time period. If a widow had children, and a lot of these widows are pregnant at the time because of their much younger ages, they're supposed to devote themselves to this child. This is the direct connection to their husband, so much so that when during the Civil War, you see a lot of language about the widow and the orphan. A child would be considered orphan if their father had died. So even if their mother is still alive, that orphan label is applied. So when Abraham Lincoln talks about widows and orphans, this is what he's referring to. And so for widows, if they lose that identity in wifehood, they should then really devote themselves to motherhood. And then in the Confederacy, what I found is that it became particularly critical that widows devote themselves to this cause, to this Confederacy, to this government that is trying to establish its legitimacy. If you think of it this way, right, if a widow could lose her husband and still support the cause that killed him, that was a really powerful endorsement. That was a powerful message to her community. But if a widow said no, right, enough is enough, this war isn't worth it, this sacrifice isn't worth it, send home my brother, send home my father, send home my male cousins, that was a really powerful indictment against the Confederacy and all that they were working for. And so what I found was that letters and newspapers and government officials, they all glorify the kind of widow who mourns her husband well, who is able to then call it a sacrifice, or that it was worth it, or that he is a gallant, it was gallant and all of this sort of thing. And if she did it well, then she could get things that she wanted and she needed from her community, and she would leverage this label. So here is my slide says, as soldiers' widows, Confederate women could leverage the label and their particular relationship with the Confederate administration in an attempt to receive support or recognition or political influence. And then likewise, Confederate officials had the opportunity to use Confederate widows, even though, again, some of them are 17, 18, 19 years old, to further their own political agendas. And some widows will play this part perfectly, right? They will do exactly what their community asks of them, but some of them won't. And this is where we get a lot of the variety and the diversity within mourning, within grieving, that some widows are too traumatized and some are too heartbroken and some were married to crummy husbands to begin with, right? So they're not exactly that sad to be rid of them, or some of them are too poor, and so economics plays a role in this. And so I'll talk about this a little bit more specifically when I dive into chapter 6 and give some quotes and some stories. But that's essentially the heart of this argument. So, all right. Why this title? So when I originally conceived of this project, I had titled it Married to the Confederacy, and I had these paired chapters based on wedding vows, right? To have and to hold till death do us part, et cetera, et cetera. But as I did more and more revisions and as my research really got deeper and deeper, it didn't fit. And so UNC Press and I agonized over what it was that we were going to title this and what would fit, and spent a lot of weeks going back and forth over different options until I stumbled across this poem. And this is after I'd written the entire book, the entire manuscript. It had gone through readers. And so, as you can see here, it's titled Heart Victories by a Soldier's Wife, and it's published in this collection of poems right after the Civil War in 1867. And so the whole thing is in the opening of the book because I think it sets the tone. But that second stanza, right? Their love, the true, the brave, the beautiful, the strong, wrestles with duty, gaunt and stern, wrestles and struggles long. He falls no more again, his giant foe to meet, leading at every opening vein, love falls at duty's feet. And so that was the image that I felt like, oh, that just captures it, right? This idea of love and duty and how these two things wrestle with one another. And here you have this image of love just falling bleeding and sacrificing to this cause. And then, sorry, I have to move my little box, my speaking box, so I can see the second part, right? So on the second image, right, the second half of the poem, again, in that middle section, kind of zooms in on the wife's experience and says, while she, the tried, the true, the loving wife of years, chokes down the rising agony, drives back the starting tears, I yield thee up, she cries, in the country's cause to fight, strike for our own, our children's home, and God defend the right. So again, this idea of choking down agony and tears and yielding up a husband to this cause. And this is the image that I found again and again and again when I was really digging into this project and doing this research. So that's where the title comes from, this poem, to set the stage. So here, you can see the chapter outline for the finished project. When I conceived of this project, it was a war project, right? One chapter on the antebellum South to kind of set the standard of what marriage looked like, what white women expected, what widowhood looked like before the war, and then the rest of it was going to wrestle with women who lose their husbands during the war. And that was my focus. And when I went to archives, that's what I was looking for. And then afterwards, I started just thinking more and more about Reconstruction and how did widows fit into that, right? And so I had to go back and do some of that research. So this is my note to graduate students who might be out there. Take pictures of everything, because you don't know what direction your research is going to lead in. Because at first, right, these were the stories that caught my attention. I was focused on this as a wartime project. So this is a young woman from Charleston, South Carolina. You can see her quote to her diary here. One looks at a man so differently when you think he might be killed tomorrow. Men up to this time I had thought dull and commonplace seemed charming. And so the start of the war, marriages, young widows, pregnant widows, conflicts with mothers and the wartime mourning of widows, that was the heart of the book. So stories, for example, like Hetty Carey, who gets married, is a wife for 3 weeks, and then her husband is killed. And so she finds herself in the same church, surrounded by the same guests, walking down the same aisle that she was in 3 weeks earlier for her wedding than at the funeral. And she is an example of someone who lives for 3 weeks, right, as a wife, and then for 15 years as a widow. But it didn't answer these other nagging questions that came to me later in the project. Did widows support the lost charge? What was their role in the Ladies Memorial Association? What about the United Daughters of the Confederacy? How did widows fit? And so I did a lot of research in newspapers to start answering this. And so we'll transition here into the 6th chapter, which I very much see as almost a first chapter for someone else's project. I'm really excited for someone to build on this and to keep it and to make it even deeper. So we'll start with our quote here. What evidence have we that the cause has died out? But when we see widows wail or hear an orphan cry, I feel the cause has indeed died out. If you let one of them wail, you may as well say the cause is dead. It shall be your cost. And so newspapers across the country pick up this speech. I find it in across, not just in the South, but across the country. It's given at a church in Richmond, Virginia, and it's printed under the title Relief for the Widows of Confederates. They declare the cause of the South is not lost. It had been nearly 2 years, right, since the final shots of this war. And yet there's this call for action, but it's not the action that readers expected or that I would have expected several years ago, right? It's not a call for guns or for weapons. It's not a call for eulogies or for monuments. In fact, it is almost against that, right? So continuing on, leave the noble memorials you have begun, which are only vanity. The Confederate dead all sleep well, thank God. And instead, this whole article is really focused on calling for support for widows, right? It talks about how they believe that this is what deceased soldiers would have wanted above all else, right? That their wives are the ones that are alive, that their wives are the ones that are suffering. And this one in particular was tied to a widow's home and fundraising. And you can see he ends with, we must provide an asylum for both widows and orphans. And again, orphans meaning the children of widows, right, who lost their husbands during the war. And this struck me, this idea that this is where the Confederate cause lay, not in marble, but in mourning women. And so in that 6th chapter, I explore this act of reconstructing a nation more broadly and the part that widows played, or in many cases did not play in this project, right? We all probably can name several elite widows who play starring roles, right? Who are on the stages, who are speaking in all of the veterans reunions. But a lot of widows don't. Many widows, it seems, are too busy, too tired, too emotionally spent, and are not participating in a lot of these formal memorialization organizations like the Ladies Memorial Association. But I think it's more than that. I think it's also that they didn't have anything to prove, right? Because as Confederate widows, they by definition had already supported and sacrificed to the cause. No one would say they had not sacrificed or proven themselves for the cause. They already had a grave where they could lay flowers in ways that intact families had not, right? So widows already had this cultural standing. And I think this really connects to my larger argument that when we look at mourning, it is really diverse, right? White women did not seamlessly work together to create this lost cause ideology. They did not seamlessly mourn. And I think it also suggests that those that the war hurt the most, in many cases, had the least left to give to it. And so this is where I spend a lot of this chapter, and I will give us some examples here, right? So here is a newspaper, September 1867, in Georgia, but it's talking about Confederate widows in Montgomery, Alabama, who publish a card in the newspapers. They claim they need to make their cause known, their case known, because they can't get work to support themselves, to support their children. They're appealing for their community, to their community for jobs. They want someone to hire them. And the commentary is that this is very troublesome, right? This Georgia reporter says, these women are the widows of the Confederate soldiers who perished in battle or died from diseases in camp. And I think that's really interesting too, because when I went into this project, I expected to be this distinction between, did your husband die in battle, like this valiant, very, public death, or did he die of disease in camp? And what I've found, at least in the research that I did, in the cases that I read, is there's not much difference. A war widow is a war widow, and it didn't matter if he, as this article suggests, was a battle death or a disease death. Anyway, and then this call for the community, this idea that the community owes them something, right? We hope the citizens of Montgomery will not disregard a cry of distress so full of agony, literally the wail of the widow and the orphan. Some more examples here from some other states, right? War widows after the war, like many people in the South, are struggling financially and also struggling with emotional wounds at the same time that there is this memorialization project that's happening, that stone monuments are being put up. And what I found in these newspapers is that a lot of people at that time are writing and saying that this is utter foolishness. So, here in a North Carolina paper in July of 1867, a sensible Virginian suggests that marble monuments to the Confederate dead will not feed starving Confederate widows and orphans, right? That this is a misplaced effort. South Carolina here, an article there agrees. And it's part of a larger piece that talks a lot about an elite widow, a widow of an officer who is financially struggling after the war and can't find a job and all of this. And concludes, as you can see here, better indeed than any eulogy, better than costly monument, better than starry pointing pyramid is the home. So again, an example of fundraising for a home for widows to offer financial support. And then another one, this one in Virginia, the title was Remember the Living, that came out in June of 1866. And again, tying to this idea, we trust that the work of decorating and honoring the graves of the dead will go on, but the noblest tribute which we can pay the memory of a dead soldier is to take care of those desolate loved ones. Let us not commit the melancholy error of expending all our sympathies upon those whose quiet slumbers no earthly honors can disturb. So a lot, and this is just a lot of people are publicly calling for support for widows, this idea that they sacrifice something and therefore they are owed something. They're not getting pensions from the United States immediately after the Civil War. And this ties into the churches as well. So here we have a reverend. This is out of Charleston, South Carolina, that he's giving an address. And it said earlier, before this quote I have on your screen, when our poor soldiers enlisted, we told them if they fell, survivors would take care of their families. It was a promise carrying with it the sanctity of an oath. Have we kept it? Do we remember that the widows of hundreds of these brave men are now suffering from want of the common necessities of life, pinched with hunger and cold? And he concludes that no, right, that communities are not taking care of the widows as they should, that they're failing to uphold the promises for Confederate soldiers, and then again targets this memorialization effort. He says, inscriptions on coin and monumental marble have sometimes a great value. We have erected monuments to the Confederate dead. And he does say that that is a noble sentiment, but then ends really bluntly with this piece I put on your screen. The dead can wait. They rest quietly in the cold grave. The grave will become no colder. And so again, for financial support, that should trump a lot of this memorialization efforts. And so when I think about Reconstruction, this shifted a lot of the ways that I thought about the Ladies Memorial Association. And I thought about all of the efforts and the decorations that we've spent so much time looking at, and really complicated this idea of what mourning was like and what the post-war South was like and what grief was like. Several people, veterans, officers who survived say things, and another quote here, if we could ask the brave men who died what they would require, they would say, give our wives and our children bread. The cause lives not in the men who died, but in the noble women and children who have lost husbands and fathers. And so, big picture here to start tying some of these things together. My goal for this book, what I hope we walk away from with this book, is this idea that when we look at the experiences, when we analyze the experiences of white Confederate widows, it changes the way that we think about the Civil War, and especially the Civil War household, right? This idea that although they share a gender, women did not wound the same, they did not work the same, they did not have the same strengths and weaknesses. And a lot of these differences emerged, particularly when their relationships were put under stress. And so I spent a lot of time looking at letters between sisters and letters between mothers and daughters and letters between mothers-in-law and their daughters-in-law and some of the support that comes out of that, but then also a lot of the conflict that comes out of that too. And then a second aim for this is to really lean into emotions and emotions history, take it really seriously, and look at this fact that the political can be so personal and that the personal can be so political, and that widows were well aware of this, right? It leaves a lasting impression both on Confederate officials, but also on the widows' communities themselves, right? They aren't just any sort of widow, they are war widows. And that brought a lot of attention. It brought a special status because of that connection to the Confederacy, both during the war and then, as I just showed, after the war too. And so for the opening of my book, I actually open with this dedication from Jefferson Davis when he writes his history of the Confederate government. And I was struck by the fact, right? He's writing this dedication. He doesn't dedicate it to the veterans who fought, his friends who are still with him. He doesn't dedicate it to the soldiers who died, who sacrificed and are no longer, with them. But he dedicates it to the women, and especially the women who mourn, as you can see here, kind of closer towards the bottom, whose annual tribute expresses their enduring grief, love, and reverence for our sacred dead. And I think that's something worth noting. So a couple of things before I stop sharing. As Paul mentioned, the book is out today, which is fantastic. And I'm really excited about that. And it's available all sorts of places, Amazon and those kinds of things. But I will give a plug here for UNC Press. If you use this discount code, it's 40% off any of their books. And there are a lot of fantastic books that have been out and that are just coming out right now in the spring. A great cohort of new research and then enduring research here. So it's 40% off, and it's 01DAH40. And we can drop that in a chat or a link or something, I'm sure, somewhere too, so that you have it. And I think they're also doing a sale right now where if you spend $75, you get free shipping. And I am all about the free shipping. So that. And then also, again, I'm looking forward to our conversation and our questions and all of that, but I want to say thank you. I know this is an especially busy time of the year. If you have kids, it's a busy time of the year. If you teach right now, it's a busy time of the year as we work through grading and those kinds of things. So I appreciate you being here tonight. If you have questions and I don't get to them, or you want to email later, my email is right here. Or if you just type in Angela Elder, Converse University, it should pop up. And my Twitter is there as well, although I'm very bad at Twitter and I don't post nearly as much as I should, but I always have high hopes that I'm going to do better. So let me stop sharing. And okay, there we go.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. What a talk. I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions. We've already got a couple here, so let's get started. One viewer is wondering about whether any recently widowed women committed suicide once they got the news of their deceased husbands. So we're starting kind of with the lowest possible stories, I think.
I'm sorry, you cut out just for a second there. Could you, all I heard, there's got to be more to the question. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that. So the question is, are there examples of women who, when they learned they lost their husbands, responded by committing suicide?
Yes. So, right. So that is, one of the darkest outcomes here. And I think it really just highlight the depth of grief. And that is something that I tried to honor in this book, is just show this enormous spectrum of how women respond, because some women, absolutely right, feel unequipped and unprepared and have no desire to continue life, seem genuinely, truly, overwhelmingly in love with their spouse and not prepared to cope. So suicide definitely there are some examples of that. There are also examples of women in the book who are so traumatized, and it comes out in all sorts of different ways. For those that are able, they get the letter that says their husband has been wounded and they're trying to get to him. Those that are able to travel are often met with that heartbreaking experience that they get there and then he's gone, right? He's already passed away. And some widows struggle to believe that, to the point that they insist that the body be dug up, that they don't believe it until they see their loved one's face. Will sometimes cause quite a scene at the grave, digging, like impatient, just these heartbreaking, horrible stories. One widow that I spend a lot of time on, just because there's so much, she left a very rich record behind. Her name is Tivy Stevens, and she actually lives in Florida, North Florida. And she is okay. I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay, good. Sorry, I think it cut out right in the middle there. I was saying Tivy Stevens, who lives in North Florida, she's courting this guy, Winston, before the war, and her parents are completely opposed to it because she is 14 years old and they consider her to be entirely too young. And they have this on again, off again relationship. At one point, she breaks up with him in a graveyard, which I just imagining that scene, right? She refuses to marry him. She doesn't want to go against her parents' wishes until she finally turns 18 and she gets married to him. The family finally gets her father's support. He leaves, fights for the Confederacy, is killed. And in her diary, in 1 week, she is going to lose her husband. She is going to give birth prematurely to a boy who she names after her late husband, Winston. And her mother is also going to pass away. And so she is an example. She doesn't commit suicide, but she is just shattered by this loss. She is not going to ever say this was a sacrifice worth it for the Confederacy. She writes in her diary about going through scrapbooks and seeing, just kind of reliving her past, going through old letters. She names her son Winston, and this is common. I found a lot of widows will name their children, if they're born after their husband's death, after that husband. Anyway, but she can't ever call him Winston. She calls him Winnie, and her sister gives her a really hard time about this and says, Winnie is an ugly name. Winnie is a girl's name. Call him after the man, after who he's named after. And she can't. She's just so traumatized. So there definitely are examples of that, who of just, and I think we see these stories today too, people who really struggle emotionally, physically, in all sorts of ways with the loss of a loved one.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's clear that you found some really painful and powerful human stories as part of your research, as you would expect with this topic. We have a two-part question from another viewer who asks, first of all, was the mourning time period always 2.5 years, or did that change from pre-war to wartime? And then the other part of the question, which is really interesting, the way they phrase it, is what does society gain by taking them, quote, off the market for 2 years? What does society gain by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, 2.5 years was the mourning etiquette before the Civil War, and it continues on in the Civil War. Of course, there are young widows before the Civil War. So it's not to say that it didn't happen. Of course it happens. It's early 1800s, early 19th century, but not to the extent that the Civil War creates this huge number of widows who are still quite young, in many cases, quite young. So that is a shift. So that 2.5 years is a constant, and it continues after the Civil War too. It's not like there's this huge push to get rid of it. I'm not sure when it officially drops. And it comes from a lot of etiquette manuals that are published in the antebellum time and during the Civil War, which are relatively affordable and then also would be shared. It was a common thing in both the North and the South, this 2.5 year period across the United States. What did they gain to have? by not remarrying. It's this interesting thing because there appears to be this fascination, and it definitely ramps up during the Civil War with widows as being particularly attractive, as being flirty, as being women with sexual knowledge. Like it's this really odd place, all very coded, right, in the language of the time. I think the ideal is that if you think about the late husband's family, a widow who moves on really quick, that can be insulting, right? That you didn't love my son enough to even mourn him for 6 months. How is he that easily replaceable? For the Confederacy, similar, right? That this is supposed to be a gallant, brave, noble, honorable. And if you go through all of the obituaries and all of the writing about any soldier who dies, it's gallant this and gallant that, and all of the word choice that they use. Again, how can someone who is so valuable and brave and honorable, how can he be replaced that quickly? So I think that's part of what about it would have been insulting. Part of it is that it was already the etiquette before the time. But widows, so, okay, to talk about the other side of the spectrum, widows who are much younger and are not heartbroken like Tivy and are not enduring the trauma and the grief of the widows I just talked about. Some of them are quite active. Some of them fit that Scarlett O'Hara flirty widow kind of category, especially if they have money to do so. There are lots of disapproving sisters, especially who say, and they write in their diaries and they write directly to their sister, I thought you'd be, more dignified than the other widows. Because in some ways, everybody's in the state of waiting, but widows, for better, for worse, they're no longer in a state of waiting. They know that they've lost their husband and they're moving into this new life. And if it was a husband we're not particularly close to. Some of them do flirt and dance, and their communities are scandalized, or they at least have some like level of secrecy. There's one widow who is courting this man, and she writes in the letter, make sure that you change your handwriting, right? She doesn't want anyone to know. She has this convoluted way that she's getting the letters from him. Some widows did get remarried in that 2.5-year period, and that kind of falls into two categories. Some of them seem to do it out of economic necessity. They don't have the luxury to mourn for 2.5 years. And so if the offer came along, they took advantage of it. Some of them did have the economic ability that they could have waited and done the full year of mourning, but chose not to. And so there's this one woman in Georgia, Fanny, quite wealthy. Her husband passes away, and within a year, she is remarried to her late husband's business partner. And she's writing these letters to her sister, and her sister talks about how all the people back home are asking what happened to her, and all of her suitors are asking, what's become of her. They don't know that she's already remarried. And apparently the sister cut off a piece of like horsehair and pretended it was a lock of hair, which is a sign of 19th century affection, and perfumed it and gave it to one of these fellows, which he put in his shirt pocket. And the sister is just laughing and laughing in this letter, talking about how he pulls it out and he presses it to her lips and sticks it back in his pocket and all of this. Meanwhile, the widow who's remarried is getting letters that are still describing the death of her late husband and how they mourn with her, and how he was someone who he had been wounded, and then he went into a friend's house because he had connections in the area, and the owner of the house says they've scrubbed the floor 3 times and they can't get the blood off the floor. Like this horrible scene. Meanwhile, like I'm sitting here and I know she's already remarried, right? She's already, and she's left this slew of suitors and this trickster sister back in Georgia, and her new husband's in Tennessee. And it's just this wild ride. So great diversity in mourning. There are 2 extremes.
Wow. The drama of
The drama.
That's incredible. Somebody is asking about the archives and whether many archives house these treasure troves of unseen files of everyday individuals, presumably more broadly than just widows. What's your response to that?
Absolutely. So that is one of my absolute favorite parts of the job. And I can't believe that I get to hold these things. And the secret that shouldn't be a secret is that I'm pretty sure just about anybody can, right? Some archives maybe are a little bit pickier, but for the most part, they're housed at universities, especially big university, Virginia Tech, for example, fantastic archive. They have a set of, rules about, clean hands, and some things you have to wear gloves, and you can only bring in a pencil, but you can take photographs of things, and it's all just there to read through: diaries, letter collections. And so universities, some libraries, depending on the library, will have really great collections. And most of this should be online. If you type in archive, in your community, or finding aids sometimes is what you can look for. There are also historic centers like Georgia Historical Society and places that house a lot of these things. And so I did, based on my topic, as you can imagine, in Southern archives. Every state in most cases has at least 3 or 4 big, great archives. For me, the biggest challenge was that there was no label in the finding aid that said widow, right? It wasn't so it again, and it depends on the archive, but they'll usually have the family names and as many names as they can. Sometimes they'll list themes or locations or battles related to it, but widow is not something I found. So in some cases, I would get lucky if it would talk about these family members and it would say somebody is married. And then later on, it'd be like, oh, and John died in 1863. And I'm like, okay, this one like has a widow collection. But a lot of what I had to do was sit and read these stories. And it got really kind of morbid in a sense, because I'd be reading through and be like, oh, this is so great. Like, this story had so much texture and it's so interesting. Like, does he die? Does he die? Oh, he doesn't die. Like, good for him, good for the family. But like, I can't use it in my study because I was so targeted on women who lost their husbands during the Civil War. And so there are, and again, it depends on the family, there are these sprawling collections for some families where they just keep everything. There are some collections where all you have are the soldiers' letters, right? So he would mail his letter home. The wife would mail her letter to him. But if he didn't mail it back to her, we don't have both sides of the collection. So that was always really valuable for me when I could get her perspective, since that was something I was really trying to illuminate here. And then beyond that, I did a lot of work in newspapers, as you just saw. Also letters that were written to government officials. So seeing, especially as the war kind of dragged on, women who are writing to local governments, state governments, governors, and saying, I need food, I need support, I need a job, and especially looking for those. And Stephanie McCurry does a lot of great work. A soldier's widow. My husband died, and therefore you owe me. I am this, I have sacrificed this, and so therefore I need this. And so that political relationship I was interested in. I don't know. I mean, it was a great project because I also got to look at things like mourning clothing, which really helped me just to conceptualize and tell these stories, to imagine, right, wearing that veil is a signifier to the rest of your community. They look at you and they know that you are in mourning. And it's that separation, right? This expectation of okay. Can you hear me again?
Yep, you're coming back.
Sorry, it's really
Okay.
windy outside, so I'm wondering if that's messing with my office Wi-Fi. Hopefully, we'll cross our fingers. Anyway, so I do encourage, even if you are not a historian, not a teacher, not a professor, you're just someone who is interested in this, the worst they can say is no. And I started this when I was in grad school, so it wasn't like I had big fancy credentials or anything. It's powerful to hold those pieces of paper. I mean, it's almost this feeling of how can I be allowed to do this? And I will say too, one upswing of the pandemic is that so much of this stuff is online. So if you're interested in more of these stories and you want to read it from the perspective of the people themselves, so many of them are digitized, and you can look at the handwriting, just like I make my students who get so grouchy with me, although they can still read cursive, and we're not going to lose that skill where they have to go through and read it online. And yeah, it's up there. So great question.
And I would add as well, historians don't tend to agree on very much, but one thing I think we all agree on is how nice archivists are. And how friendly and welcoming and helpful archivists can be. So yeah, definitely I would echo Angela's comments there.
Yep. And that is one of my biggest regrets, because again, I worked on this project for a long time and I'm starting a new project now and I'm doing it totally differently in the sense that I did not write down all of the archivist names when I first started this project. And again, if you are a grad student or if you're a writer and you're doing this kind of work, that's one of my biggest regrets is when I go through my acknowledgements and all the people I want to thank, that I can't list those fantastic archivists by name from early in the project because I didn't write it down, and they are the kindest, most wonderful, generous people.
So speaking of the sources that you used in the book, did you use gravestones or cemetery markers in any way?
I was really curious with widows who remarried, where they were buried. And so a lot of times I would try to find that out. Sometimes it would give me important dates. If I had, death date, or I'm sorry, a lot of times, so I could find the husband, so I'd find his death information. So if she was buried nearby, then that could give me how long she lived after him, which was really valuable to me in cases where it was spotty. I didn't do as much with the inscriptions. That would have been a really powerful source. Mostly it was for location purposes, and also trying to figure out if she was successful in getting a body reinterred. And again, that has an economic side to it as well. Those that I described who didn't have enough food to even make ends meet, obviously are not.
I think the wind must be picking up there in South Carolina. We'll give Dr. Elder a minute or two to come back.
There we go.
All right.
Okay. I was saying that for widows who don't have a lot of money, obviously are not doing this project, but I was curious, and I didn't do any statistical analysis, but how many elite widows are moving or reinterring or trying to get bodies home to the family cemetery. And a lot of cases they are, and not for its own moldering sake, but to have a place to mourn, I think was really important for some widows, to have that physical, again, especially if they have children, to have that physical spot to go every year and keep the memory alive.
Yeah. We have a question about compensation from the government, presumably not the US government, but Confederate state governments, maybe. Did they get pensions, anything like that?
Yeah, not immediately. And it was state by state for a while, and it didn't kick in again, because it was state by state. In some places it's 5 years, in some places it's 10 years, in some places it's not until the United States government gives pensions to all widows. Pensions were not a source that I worked with much, just because when I started trying to use it as a source, I found it to be a needle in a haystack, unless I knew that she had lost her husband in the war, because in order to get a pension, it was just their husband had served. And so what I found when I originally started going through them is, for every one widow whose husband had died in the war and is eventually getting a pension in the 1900s, there was like 30 of widows whose husbands die after the war and are applying and getting pensions, which was just outside the scope of my study, since so much of what I was looking at was during the war years, where there was no pension, and immediately after the war, where again there was no government assistance. Some communities did better than others as far as having either a widow's home, or just trying to have great. Some widows had a strong community and some didn't, and seemed to struggle a lot more, and would write in the newspapers, I'm opening my house up for people to board here. Oh, by the way, I'm a Confederate widow. I'm looking for a teaching job. Oh, by the way, my husband died in the war. And so again, trying to use that label to get the things that they needed from their community, since the pensions were not there.
Yeah, great, thanks. We have a really interesting question about whether you have examples of widows sharing the news about their husbands' deaths with enslaved people. and whether there was any effort in these examples to involve enslaved people in acknowledging the death and mourning and that kind of thing.
Yep. No, I did not find any examples of that. Not to say that they weren't there. The most interaction I found in that relationship was when the husband was still alive and the wives would be complaining about enslaved people, complaining about behaviors and attitudes and struggling to maintain mastery. It was not a very positive image for anyone involved. So I did not find that. There was one story of a widow who supposedly insisted her enslaved man, as she called it, slept with her and slept with her often. Is it rumor or hearsay? I don't know, of course, but it is something that showed up in one of the records that I looked at. There's one example too of a widow who's writing kind of fluffy lost cause narratives. And she writes this imaginary story about the loss of a husband, and then come to find out it wasn't her, it was an African-American woman in town who they had the same name, and how relieved she is and all of this. And of course, doesn't touch the whole racial aspect of this. So it is something it did not come up as much after the husband had passed away. Good question.
Right. Yeah. So you pointed a bit towards widows' role in the lost cause mythology after the Civil War. How about a little later, maybe when Confederate monuments began to proliferate? Were they still involved then?
Not much. Again, elite widows, some widows, like, for example, Emily Todd Helm, who is the younger sister of Mary Todd Lincoln, a Confederate widow, caused a lot of drama during the Civil War by going to the White House. So literally a Confederate widow whose husband had just died fighting for the Confederacy is in the US White House and causes problems there for Lincoln because of her strong, outspoken Confederate support. She never takes the oath of loyalty. And after the war does a lot as far as being at dedications for monuments, being at veterans reunions, speaking on the stage. She never remarries. She wears black for her entire life. Refers to herself always as, the wife of General Helm and all of this. So some widows are active, but what I found is that they were more the exception than the rule. It seems, and again, most of my research, it's just one chapter. I think there's a lot more there, and I'd be really excited to have somebody build on it. But when I went through Ladies Memorial Association rolls, those that I went through, especially in Virginia, most that I could tell were not widows. And right, so I don't have all of the records that I would love to have from that to say, okay, well then why? I just have all of these other stories kind of around it to start piecing it together. So
yeah. Thank you. You mentioned one of the points I found really interesting was that there didn't seem to be much differentiation between widows whose husbands had died a battlefield death versus those who had died from disease. How about deserters? Were there any examples you came across of widows of deserters?
Yes, there's one in particular. And now I will not remember if it is Arkansas or Missouri or where he was, but he's not a deserter, but he's going to be shot in retaliation for some other. So he knows when he's going to be shot and killed, and he writes a letter to his wife. I mean, it's his last letter. He knows it's going to be his last letter, and all of his directions about meet me in heaven, which is really common, that religious sentiment. We see it in a lot of letters circled at the bottom of soldiers, how he wants his children to be raised, his love for his wife, his confidence that she's going to do well. And then I was not able to find I spent forever. I couldn't find anything right about her widowhood, or if people thought worse of her because of this whole complicated situation that she found herself in. deserters specifically, there certainly was guilt in the abstract, right? That it was so important for for wives to support their husbands because you didn't want him to become a deserter. I did not find anything concrete about a married deserter who was potentially shot, what that widowhood looked like. For the most part, those were people who were, didn't have were typically not upper class. And so it was already spotty with the letters even to find those records. And so I didn't find anything like a diary or letters from her or her perspective. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that would be really an interesting dynamic if we had the sources to explore it, just because of what we know about how important wives could be in prompting husbands to desert or encouraging them indirectly even. So yeah, that would be really interesting to know how those widows responded.
yeah, absolutely.
So we have a question about enslaved people. Were there any kind of expectations for grieving widows of enslaved men who died in the Civil War?
Yes. So it was expected that the entire family, in their terms, right, would be mourning. Um, in the etiquette books, I didn't find any examples of them writing about this. That's not to say it wasn't there, but I don't know if there was a specific month rule in the same way that white widows had that 2.5 years as far as what that would have looked like, but wearing a black armband if they are male, wearing black, gray, or lavender clothing if female would have been something that the entire household did for a period of time. And so again, that would often mean dyeing those clothes that way. It gets really dicey, of course, depending on the location of the widow. In some cases, she's left, if she is someone who was part of a plantation, she may have left that plantation to live with in-laws or live with extended family. So in some cases, she's not physically there, but for those that were physically there, and if it was a part of the war in which slaves if she was still physically there, it would have been the entire household that would have been in mourning, the children and those that were enslaved.
This is an interesting one, maybe a hypothetical, but were there any known occurrences of a husband thought to be deceased who then came home to find his widow remarried?
No, and I looked for them. I mean, it had to have happened. It had to have. There were so many instances where widows lived in or women, wives, lived in a state of expectation, thought that they were widows, and then found out a month later the letter finally arrived and he was still alive. So I found examples of that, of people who thought they were widowed, but then got the letter. And then there were so many examples of women who are writing saying things like, thank goodness he died in clothing that we recognize. So if they were sent a lock of hair or a piece of the clothing as proof, many women wanted proof, right, that it was her husband who had been killed and not a misunderstanding. And there are these cases of just waiting, right? Of just waiting, because many women, depending again on the battle and the location, and the situation, we're at the mercy of someone having, a stranger writing a letter, and women dreaded the arrival of a letter in handwriting, unfamiliar handwriting. That was something that many women wrote about because they knew it could be someone they didn't know describing that their loved one had passed away. But no, I did not. Again, not to say it didn't happen. It feels like the law of numbers is that it had to have, but I did not find any examples of someone who remarried and then surprise.
What about the extended families? You mentioned, I think, very briefly in your talk, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law exchanging correspondence, but how was it in general with the extended families after the death of the husband?
So there was a wide spectrum there, and it could be a really tense relationship. So typically, broadly, the longer the wife had been in the family, the less likely there was for tension, right? So if she had been married 10 years before the war, then typically it seems like she and her mother-in-law had a positive relationship and that they navigated things. There was still sometimes tension about wanting the widow to move closer to the in-laws for support and that sort of thing, but nothing too terrible. The tense relationships tended to be women who married right at the beginning of the Civil War, or even during the Civil War, and then he dies. And especially if she was pregnant and it was her first child, then a lot of times there was a likelihood for there to be tension with the mother-in-law. So from the mother's perspective, right, this is her son who she has loved for 20 plus years and is instantly gone. And so when the wife, who's very new into the family, has a child, if it's a boy, if it looks just like her baby boy, that brought up a lot of emotion. For widows, it depended. Some of them got along wonderfully with their in-laws and would move in with their in-laws for support, and welcomed the mother-in-law in their lives and their children's lives. Some of them, especially again, if they had married right before the war, during the war, didn't feel as connected to that family and wanted to go to their birth family. Often to the frustration of the in-laws, who feel like they have some sort of claim still, especially over the children who are their son's children or child or pregnancy. But for some widows, they would prefer, again, to go back to their mother or their father if that's the situation that they were in. And so it gets a little tense in some cases. And again, points to just when we think about women in mourning, we can't speak in these broad strokes because there are all of these varieties that interplay with personality. One widow feels like her husband was killed because she didn't get along with her mother-in-law. Like, she writes this tragic note to her own mother, who's back in Texas. She's living with her in-laws, and she had already been complaining and talking about how much she fought with this mother-in-law, and their personalities did not get along. And then when her husband dies, she says, I feel like God is punishing me and the mother for our actions to one another. And that's the last letter. I don't have anything else from that story. It's just this one letter that she writes. And it shows some of those relationships.
Wow.
Mhm.
Well, we have time for one more question, and I've got kind of a couple of variations from different people on what's a similar question, really. So one person asks it basically, what's your favorite story from the book? And another puts a bit more specifically, was there a particular widow who stands out for you as someone who was successful in overcoming her grief and the challenges of it?
Gosh, that is such a hard question, because there are a lot of stories, and that, if when my readers, so when you publish with an academic press, you have two anonymous readers who read the entire thing and give you suggestions. And it's wonderful, and gives you, just when you get so inside your head when you're writing, to have that back. If anything, the critique that I get in my writing is that there's so many stories, there's so many examples, there's so many people, because that's what I love. That's why I got into this. I think it's unbelievable that we get to read these letters and have all of these stories that are still with us, but are just hiding in archives. And that I had the opportunity to read them. And so I wanted to shove them all into the book. And so there's a lot of favorites and a lot of memorable ones. I think one of the ones that continues to stick out with me the most is Emily Todd Helm, little sister of Mary Lincoln. Because when I was early in this project, I knew that Lincoln had a lot of in-laws, but I didn't really know much. And then coming to find that when Lincoln talks about this being a war of brother versus brother, he's literally thinking of his in-laws, right? Because his wife's family splits, half supporting the United States, the Union, half supporting the Confederacy. And the fact that he has this sister-in-law who before the war, he calls her little sister. She writes this story about the first time she giant, and she expected him to say fee fi fo fum, and she hid in the skirts of her mother, and he pulls her out as a child and says, this is little sister. And then her husband had been in the United States military, and Abraham Lincoln calls him into his office, right, and says, please, like, stay. And he says no, he's from Kentucky and he's going to fight for the Confederacy, and then he dies. And so she is just someone, because again, she's elite, she left a lot of written records behind. Because she's connected to the Lincoln, she left a lot behind. And then when she talks about her grief and mourning with Mary, but then they're on opposite sides of this, so she says it's like a barrier of granite between them, they can't connect, you know. And there's also an age difference, Mary's a lot older. And then in the ways that Mary seems to quote unquote do it all wrong, right, she mourns too much, some people call her crazy, she goes on these spending sprees, and she is not beloved by her society, whereas Emily does everything she can to be beloved by the Confederacy, including writing these extremely racist things and being in the United Daughters of the Confederacy, but she wins her society's approval. And so I think it's this fascinating moment to look at these two sisters and to think about grief and what it could be like in one family to go in such different directions. So
That's great. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. A fantastic book, by the way, which I know more and more people are going to be buying after tonight's presentation. I appreciate the responses to the questions as well. And thanks to everyone who came along tonight. We really appreciate you joining us. Hopefully see you again in the future at future Virginia Center for Civil War Studies events. I feel really lucky that thanks to the generosity of donors to the center, we're able to put on these kinds of events, often without a charge for the public. We'll have more next academic year beginning in probably September. So I hope to see you again. And in the meantime, thanks very much to Dr. Elder for such a wonderful presentation. Good night.